vot niimoodi ma kujutan ette muusika. See on nagu toit, see on nagu mingisugune põld, kus kasvab see vili.
One lesson that I hope has emerged from the last few lectures is that although avant-garde serial music obviously is very difficult to listen to and difficult to compose, minimalist music is also difficult to compose if easy to listen to. It's not enough to just simply repeat a single chord and call it minimalism. In fact, the minimalist composers, and they were diverse, constructed many different systems that are equal in precision to those of the avant-garde serialists. So in some ways, these two classes of composers were after the very same thing, creating an honest musical texture using predetermined processes, but the end results sounded drastically different. Another thing that we learned is that the same people who write minimalism were often the same people who also wrote serialism. As we have seen with Lamont Young and Terry Riley, these composers started their careers in the 12-tone and serialist tradition. This was also the case with later generations of composers, such as the two composers we're going to discuss today from Eastern Europe, Henryk Górecki from Poland and Arvo Pärt from Estonia. Their music is very different from the music of Meredith Monk or Julius Eastman or Steve Reich, although the term minimalism was slapped onto them as well, mostly from a marketing perspective. Composers from the Soviet Union countries and the satellite nations gravitated towards a simplified style of music that became known as minimalist. For a variety of reasons, holy minimalism came to signify a new genre of spiritual, religious music that transcends any particular faith, but nevertheless translates that very stripped down, almost medieval sounding texture that almost became a stereotype of itself. The reasons for this are broad. There was a growing taste in the 1970s and 80s for music that was tonal as opposed to difficult and serialist. Postmodern philosophy, which folded past into the present as one single idea, also resisted this idea that tonality was somehow dead. In fact, it was very alive and well, and very lucrative. There is a growing sense that minimalism somehow could tap into this generational angst about Cold War politics, about income inequality, and about the fatigue from technology and urbanization. Like other movements, neoclassicism comes to mind. A stripped down, almost nostalgic style seemed to be the exact antidote to what people needed at a particular time, although the way in which people listened to this music was also very diverse. One composer who kind of accidentally became the spokesperson for this new style of so-called holy minimalism was the Polish composer Henryk Górecki. Górecki was almost the same age as Krzysztof Penderecki, who we met in a previous lecture and who was famous for his sonoristic, very jarring, dissonant works. Both Górecki and Penderecki started their careers in that serialist tradition in the 1960s. But whereas Penderecki went in the more neo-romantic direction, Górecki stripped down his texture even more and started relying on modal as well as tonal elements. Poland being a very Roman Catholic country, Górecki embraced his Roman Catholicism and used that as a way to channel a new musical style that was refreshing, but at the same time very reminiscent of a more romantic type of texture. And the piece that most typified this new style was his Symphony No. 3, the Symphony of Sorrowful Songs, which premiered in 1976. This is a long symphony, it's about an hour long, and each movement features a soprano soloist who sings texts revolving around mourning either a parent or a child. The texts themselves are very diverse. Movement 1 features a Polish Renaissance motet featuring themes of the Virgin Mary. Movement 2 is actually writing that was found scratched onto a wall of a Gestapo cell during the occupation during World War II. Movement 3 is a folk song from the western Polish region of Silesia. The work was met with success when it premiered, but it wasn't until a 1992 CD recording with Dawn Upshaw, the American soprano, as the soloist, that this work really took off in worldwide sales. Rare for a classical music recording, it reached over 1 million sales and topped Billboard charts. Critics have been trying to understand why this work, that was at this time a couple of decades old, would somehow emerge into this mainstream commercial realm. One reason was, around the 1980s and 90s, there was a taste for New Age culture, yoga, holistic practices, Eastern and exotic types of borrowing of wellness and spirituality. And as a compact disc recording, there was also a market for background music. You can throw on Górecki's very, very slow and sorrowful symphony that is inoffensive, but also not distracting. And it could work very well sipping your Chardonnay in a restaurant. That's how critics were trying to figure out the actual meaning of why this particular work would be so successful. Górecki himself commented on this phenomenon. He said, "Perhaps people find something they need in this piece of music. Somehow I hit the right note, something they were missing." I'm struck by the lack of determinism in his statement. Whereas a composer like Babbitt or Boulez would want complete control over how a piece is composed and how a piece is listened to, Górecki put a work out into the world without concern about being stylistically innovative or modern. And ironically, it garnered a great deal of success both in critical circles and in a commercial space. We're going to listen to a fragment of the first movement of this symphony. There's a clear influence of Mahler in these symphonies. Judging purely by their length, Movement 1 is 27 minutes of a sequence of modal canons. Górecki cycles through the Dorian, Aeolian, Locrian, and all of the other modes. The music does not move very fast. Each movement is basically a slow movement. There is no sonata form present, but rather a slow ascent and descent of scalar modes. The soprano joins the orchestral canon at around 13 minutes. She sings the Polish text of the Lamentation of the Holy Cross Monastery from the 15th century. The text translated is, "My son, my chosen and beloved, share your wounds with your mother, and because, dear son, I have always carried you in my heart and always served you faithfully, speak to your mother to make her happy, although you are already leaving me my cherished hope." Despite the difference in language, can you pick up the meaning of the text in the music when the soprano enters? What do you make of this radically stripped down modal texture? Is it derivative, or is it something entirely modern given the time? Here's a fragment from the first movement of Górecki's Third Symphony. The never-ending canons that define this movement give the music a sense of never-ending texture, almost as if this were an example of ambient music, another genre that became very popular around the 1980s and 1990s. Music that can inoffensively fill a space without drawing too much attention to it. So it begs the question of how people started listening to classical music around the turn of the 1980s and 90s. Classical music was not simply an intellectual exercise that required education and attention. Classical music can also be a form of wellness. It can disappear into the background, but its holistic effects can be felt. Why not listen to Gorecki's Third Symphony while doing yoga? This was a very different way of conceptualizing what it meant to be a classical music composer and how a classical music composer could break into a mainstream commercial realm. Another composer who broke through into the mainstream and is still one of the most famous composers alive today is the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt. You heard from Pärt in the opening of this video. In fact, Pärt has a persona of being this very reclusive, introverted, spiritual figure, and yet he is recorded on video and documentary film more than any composer I can think of who is still alive. There's a certain irony in his music between the public persona of him being the face of the neotonal classical music generation and this very quiet type of personality that he portrays on camera. Like Gorecki, Pärt began his career writing bombastic serialist music. And also like Gorecki, he turned to religion when he got writer's block in the 1970s. An important thing to remember is that Pärt was able to leave the Soviet bloc and moved to Germany, where he was able to freely compose any style he wanted. After all, religion was still ostracized in the Soviet Union. During the 1970s, he takes a break from serious composition and studies early music, specifically the music of Gregorian chant, and as well as bells. He studies the acoustics of bells and how they resonate. By 1976, he emerges with a new style that he called the bell style, or tintinnabuli style. According to tintinnabuli style, there is a note against note counterpoint that creates the effect of a bell. The basis of Pärt's tintinnabuli style is two-part counterpoint, where one voice is the diatonic melody, which theorists have called the M voice, while the second voice provides a triadic overtone that's called the T voice. Together they create this bell-like sound that is very pure but still very controlled in terms of rules of counterpoint. This radically stripped-down approach to composition continues to be Pärt's main inspiration to this day. He composed a string of very short and simple works featuring the tintinnabuli style. What's really unusual about these works, especially works like Tabula Rasa, Fratris, and Spiegel im Spiegel, all from the late 1970s, is how commercially successful they've become. To this day, filmmakers use Pärt's music to create a sense of expansion or simplicity or purity. Here's a scene from the 2013 film Gravity, which featured Pärt's music in space. Pärt's music is known as being spiritual without being overtly religious. He was a devout practitioner of Russian Orthodox faith. However, a lot of his music does not have this overt sacredness to it. That being said, Pärt also composed actual sacred music, like his 7 magnificent antiphons from 1988. And at this point, I would like you to turn to number 223 of your anthologies. O Weisheit is the first of his 7 magnificent antiphons. If you remember, an antiphon is a piece of sacred choral music that has 2 opposing choral forces. Sometimes they stand across from each other in a space, or sometimes the music is simply notated so that there's 2 different smaller groups of choirs. The text is sacred and praiseworthy. O wisdom, sprung forth from the mouth of the Most High, you embrace the world from one end to the other. In strength and mildness you put everything in order. O come and reveal to us the way of wisdom and understanding. This is an example of a more advanced version of his tintinnabuli style, where you have a diatonic melody and a triadic overtone. The principal melody, which we can call the M voice, will appear in the tenor, where it is doubled in parallel thirds. The entire melodic range remains within the span of a third. This is the control of his music. It does not overreach. The other voices of the ensemble derive their pitches from the A major triad. These are the T voices. The bass and soprano lines are limited to E and A, arranged as a perfect fourth or fifth. So the texture is very, very tightly controlled. There's a certain amount of that serialist influence here, in the sense that the music has these limitations placed on it. But as you listen, I want you to compare Pert's music to Górecki's. In what ways are they similar, and in what ways do they evoke a very different type of neotonal style? There is no question that this music is tonal, but sometimes people use the term neotonal to describe late 20th century reusings of Romantic era harmonies. One reason for that is the simple construction. The movement only has 6 different harmonies. It is not fueled by progressive tonality the way that 19th century harmony was, but rather by stasis. The harmony does not actually move much. This simplicity, coupled with the sustained quiet dynamics, supports this antiphon's plea for wisdom and understanding. Think of the text, after all. Also, the movement does not really sound romantic in the 19th century sense, but actually sounds more like Gregorian chant, what Gregorian chant would sound like if it were composed in the 20th century. We have seen very different approaches to minimalism. It was used, weaponized, and marketed to mean any sort of attempt to resist the advanced serialist procedures of the 1950s and 60s. For some composers like Górecki and Pärt, minimalism, neotonality, and modal simplicity were ways out of a writer's block and a way into a spiritual understanding of music. For other composers like Julius Eastman and Meredith Monk, minimalism meant artistic freedom, an ability to express themselves in ways that resisted a status quo. Minimalism is still very much a style today. A lot of these composers are still alive and composing. But it's important to think about how minimalism has progressed from its early experimental phase in the 1960s to today. Like romantic textures, it's very easy to sound derivative and cliched by using minimalist sounds. Like any compositional style, this is something that is still very much current, and every composer who wants to attempt this kind of style needs to recreate it for themselves, as opposed to imitate the past. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.